The motion that set Conflict of Interest Act regarding the disclosure of assets of public office holders and whether changes are needed regarding blind trusts or ethics screens. In his annual report for 24-25, Commissioner Conrad von Finkelstein made recommendations for changes, which I agree with, and we'll discuss in more detail in a few minutes. At the September 15th meeting of this committee, the commissioner stated the changes to the Act to require public office holders to sell assets rather than putting them into a blind trust would be counterproductive. I agree. His comment that this might result in large income tax bills that would discourage good people from getting into politics is a good point. Nevertheless, some public office holders will give their trustees the freedom to sell assets and reinvest. What is important is to ensure that an ethics screen is in place to prevent a public office holder from being directly involved in decision-making that might benefit assets that remain in the trust. In the case of Prime Minister Carney, the ethics screen was set up by the commissioner and is administered by the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and the Clerk of the Privy Council. First, given Commissioner von Finkelstein's extensive background in business law, the justice system, and the federal court, I can't think of anyone more qualified to set up an effective screen mechanism. Second, in Canada, there is a strong tradition that the Clerk of the Privy Council is completely nonpartisan, and so I think his role in the screen is appropriate. The Chief of Staff is partisan and is trusted by the Prime Minister. I think it is important for the Prime Minister to have someone involved in the screen mechanism whom he can trust to make the trust work and who will likely advise the Prime Minister out of an excess and abundance of caution. In his annual report, the Commissioner made the following recommendations. Number one, a provision for the appointment of an interim commissioner when no permanent commissioner has been appointed. Two, adding apparent conflicts of interest to the definition of conflicts of interest that must be avoided by public office holders. Three, relaxing provisions regarding certain types of assets. Four, harmonizing the definitions of private interest in the Act and the Code. Five, expanding allowed outside activities. And six, increasing administrative monetary penalties. I agree with all of these recommendations, and I hope your committee will work to expedite the legislative changes needed to bring them about. I think that the proposed change that you should examine most closely is the one regarding apparent conflicts of interest. The current accepted definition of apparent conflict of interest, as noted by the Commissioner, is a situation where, quote, there is a reasonable perception which a reasonably well-informed person could properly have that a public office holder's ability to exercise an official power or perform an official duty or function will be or must have been affected by his or her private interest or that of a relative or friend. 35 years ago, there was a consensus among those studying conflicts of interest that apparent conflicts of interest should not be prohibited because the definition is too vague. Thinking has changed since that time, mostly because of public outrage over the technicalities of the differences between real and apparent conflicts of interest. Apparent conflicts of interest are prohibited by the Code, and it makes no sense that they would not be prohibited by the Act as well.
On blind trusts, you mentioned that if I could characterize it as a perception of inefficiency in having a designated public office holder sell their assets instead of placing them in a blind trust. The Commissioner, during his appearance, which you're familiar with, said that the trustees generally don't sell what's placed into the trust. And so the public office holder knows exactly what went in. So is there an issue with not just the characterization of it being a blind trust, but also with the reality of them knowing, and their advisors knowing, and their cabinet colleagues and other officials knowing exactly what went in?
Well, that's a very important question. And I have talked with former public office holders who, having very high ethical standards, have told their trustee, you can sell anything in my trust. I just don't want to know whether my assets are still in there or if they've changed. And then after he became free of being a public office holder, he was quite shocked at what had been sold and what he thought were the very poor decisions of the trustee about the replacements. So it's a chance that public office holders take. It's something that having these required divestments, and the blind trust being one possibility in politics, is only about 30 to 40 years old. We're experimenting. And this is why I think it might be good to have a major study of various different systems in Canada and other countries, and what works best, what needs to be changed. It's a complex issue. But I think if, once again, I think the focus is mostly on the screens that have been set up for Mark Carney, and will they work? Will they create problems? Only time will tell for that.
Okay, Mr. Barrett. Sorry, Mr. Greene. Mr. Barrett has a question.
Okay.
So, in the case of you raised the Prime Minister and his screen. So during the most recent campaign, the Prime Minister said, and it was reported on, that he had crafted the Liberal Party platform. Now, at that time, he was just exiting his private sector career, and of course was very aware of all of the investing that he had done, and what was inside the investments that he had created for Brookfield Asset Management, those particular funds. And at that time, the screens weren't in place yet, and so the timing of his Mr. Carney's election as leader of his party, his appointment as Prime Minister, and then the subsequent election campaign, that all took place before these measures had been taken. But the policy document that underpins now the political document that underpins the government's policy documents was written by him without any any space between. So does the system protect public confidence of our institutions in a case like that?
Well, we are never going to get a system that is perfect. We have to experiment, and we really have to depend on the integrity of public office holders to make difficult decisions like this. My experience with looking at political scandals federally and provincially is that the people that we have to worry about are those whose finances are close to the line, and they might be tempted to do something unethical to make sure that they have a nest egg when they retire. If someone is very, very well off, they're much less likely to be tempted to benefit themselves because they're already pretty well off. But as I say, you raise legitimate questions, and it's something worth looking into more thoroughly.
We have a Prime Minister now who owns the Brookfield Assets Management that controls 916 companies and manages billions of dollars, and has interests in the 5 major fields that are impacted by Bill C-5. Do you not believe that the screen that applies to Prime Minister Carney through his Chief of Staff and through the clerk without divulging the interests of people regarding the interests of Brookfield assets. There's no research done on that, to my knowledge. I asked the question to the Commissioner and he did not have an answer. Do you not believe that the screen is perhaps insufficient for conflict of interest? And final question, and perhaps I'll come back to this later. Some positions, some jobs in the private sector might make it so that their work is incompatible with becoming Prime Minister on an ethically.
Let me deal with your second question first, because that's a new one that I haven't thought of before. I'm an optimist. I think that no matter what someone's background is or has been, I think that everybody should be capable of becoming Prime Minister. Although it's good to have a runway in order to prepare for this. And of course, in the last year, we haven't had much of a runway. And your first question was, and can you remind me, please?
Compte tenu des intérêts.
Because of the interests of Brookfield and the bill, the Prime Minister is making all decisions. It's not just a minister in a cabinet of ministers. It's the Prime Minister who's giving all of these directives. And even though he has a blind trust, the decisions that he makes will increase his assets, even if he doesn't know by how much they will increase. So do you not believe that that screen is perhaps insufficient?
Can get a brief response, Mr. Greene, please.
Yeah. There will be some situations where perhaps the Chief of Staff will say to the Prime Minister, this particular piece of legislation, I'm afraid, might affect the value of your, significantly, the value of your assets that went into the trust. Maybe it's, for this particular thing, it's time to just actually go beyond the screens to disclose what is still in the trust and say, look, this is what I've done. This is my decision. I've recused myself. Leave it up to the public to decide whether I've done the right thing. So there may well be some difficult decisions to make in the future about this. But once again, these are complex questions that I really hope that there will be further studies about.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Greene. Merci, Monsieur Terriel. Le premier tour est...
That concludes the first round. We're going to move on to the second round of questions.
You have 5 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Professor Greene, I'd like to ask you some questions about ethics screens that can be set up by the Ethics Commissioner pursuant to Section 29 of the Act in respect of public office holders. At the end of your opening statement, you spoke of the importance of public confidence in the robustness of our ethics laws. And in that regard, there has been some criticism of ethics screens from the standpoint of transparency, insofar as they effectively enable a public office holder to get around reporting requirements under Section 21 sub 1 of the Conflict of Interest Act, which requires a public office holder to publicly report each occasion that they recuse themselves to avoid a conflict of interest. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
In my past life, when I worked for the Alberta government, my wife was an auditor who sometimes was asked to audit some of the agencies that I was responsible for. So ethics screens had to be set up for both of us. So I understand being covered by an ethics screen. And you have to ask a lot of hard questions about the specific situation. It's hard to generalize about them. But I think in the end, it's up to the integrity of the people involved to make sure that you're trying to make decisions that are as impartial as possible, that are in the public good. And you have to be able to defend your actions as being ethical and in the public good. And as I say, there's no there isn't a perfect cast in stone solution. It depends on each individual situation.
I think what you have said, or what I understand you to have said, is that we are, with respect to the Prime Minister's ethics screen, for example, to simply trust the Prime Minister, the clerk of the Privy Council, and the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, both of whom serve at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. Can you understand that many Canadians, from the standpoint of having confidence that the ethics screen is working, might find that wanting?
I think that many Canadians don't understand the difference between a potential conflict of interest and a real conflict of interest. All of you, and I'm sure you yourself, have found yourself in a potential conflict of interest. There's no corruption involved in that. It's simply part of life. You have to take appropriate measures to make sure potential conflicts don't become real conflicts or apparent conflicts. And if you don't take those steps, or other people don't advise you to take those steps, then there's trouble. So I think many Canadians see potential conflicts of interest and on the horizon for Prime Minister Carney, because of who he is and his background.
If I may, sir, what's lacking is transparency. We're simply left to trust. So, again, I think that is problematic. And again, I mean, how is that better than simply requiring that the Prime Minister publicly disclose, publicly report each and every time a conflict of interest or potential conflict of interest arises with respect to Brookfield or any of the companies that are part of that very vast ethics screen, 89 companies.
Yeah, that's, you know, it's a very complex question, because that sort of information might might create problems on its own. There may be people, dishonest people, who want to try to impress the Prime Minister by investing in their assets. There may be foreign governments who may be trying to influence Canada by investing in the confirmed Prime Minister's assets. And so there are all kinds of problems that could result from being overzealous. I think the system that we have right now, based on our 40 years of experience with these kinds of things, works as well as it can. It's not perfect. There will need to be changes made in the future. But as I say, these are such complex questions. Maybe it's time for a Royal Commission to look into them more thoroughly.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Greene. Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Ms. Church, for 5 minutes, please. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Greene, thank you for being with us today, and thank you for acknowledging, I think, the shared fond memories we have of being at two great institutions in Canada, the University of Alberta and the University of Toronto, also my alma maters. I want to ask you a little bit about, because I think it's significant that Parliament enumerated within the objectives of the Conflict of Interest Act that the very purpose of the Act included an objective of encouraging experienced and competent persons to seek and accept public office, and to facilitate interchange between the private and public sector. Can you just talk a little bit about why you think those objectives might be an important piece to the framework that we're discussing today?
Well, yes, we want people to get involved in public life who have a broad range of experience in many different sectors of society. and to create rules that are unnecessarily strict so as to discourage good people from getting involved in politics, I think is counterproductive. It's important to have rules that are strong enough that where most Canadians think that the people getting involved in politics have high ethical standards. I mentioned the Royal Commission on Party Financing and Electoral Reform back in which reported in 1991. One of the exercises that we undertook was to have a couple of days of meetings with representatives of all the parties. I think we chose 5 women and 5 men from every party that existed in 1991 to talk about ethics and how to promote ethics. And one thing that I remember from those 2 days of meetings was that the equal number of men and women, many women said they are reluctant to get involved in politics because the ethical standards are so low. There need to be stricter standards and more women would get involved in politics. The men tended to be of a different point of view. Oh, if they're too strict, you'll keep too many good people out. So it's a question of finding a balance. And as I say, I'm interested in studying ethics in politics because I want Canadians to have a high opinion of people that get involved in politics.
Professor Greene, or Dr. Greene, rather, we often say that public office holders, like the Prime Minister, would just have to recuse themselves if there's a decision that needs to be made that would impact their assets in a blind trust. I imagine this might be something that would happen frequently with the implementation of C5. If an individual needs to recuse themselves 60 or 100 times during their mandate, are they truly seated in the right spot?
I'm not sure that recusal would be necessary that frequently. I'm familiar with the kinds of business that Parliament does, and I just don't think that it would happen all that frequently. Now, keep in mind that the Minister of
Alors,
Finance.
qu'est-ce qui serait
Apologies for interrupting you, but what would be acceptable in your view in the number of times that one would have to recuse oneself as a Prime Minister making decisions that have an impact on Canada's economy? If we are to recuse ourselves and the Chief of Staff stays in the room, well, I don't think that Cabinet will be making a decision that would go against the interests of the person recusing themselves. That's not a minister, he's the Prime Minister, and he has power over all of the people in that room who are making decisions. Should there not be more stringent requirements for such a situation? This is something that we're seeing right now. It's important for the management of conflict of interest. It's something that's very interesting to academics right now as well.
Yes, well, keep in mind that legislation that has a general impact on the public doesn't lead to individual conflicts, real conflicts of interest. For example, the Minister of Finance, you might be able to argue that the Minister of Finance bringing down tax legislation has a conflict of interest. But because taxes affect everyone, including the Minister of Finance, there's no real conflict of interest there. And I think most legislation that the Prime Minister would deal with would have that general application, incidentally affecting the Prime Minister's assets. So I just don't think that there would be recusal very often. I would guess a couple of times a year at the most.
Écoutez, moi,
I disagree. When we look at Bill C5, Brookfield has interests in the rail, in national gas, pipelines, nuclear. Westinghouse belongs to Brookfield and will be using nuclear energy to build small nuclear reactors. This is a policy that was pushed through at the House. We know that all of this will be back on the table, and so the Prime Minister will have to say that Westinghouse won't be able to put in an offer in order to be ethical. And I wouldn't be happy if I were at Brookfield, because in order to be ethical, well, that would be necessary, and there will be conflicts of interest, not only apparent. It's the Prime Minister making decisions. It's not a minister leaving the room when the Prime Minister can still be there and make a decision. There won't be any impact on the public's trust if it's just a minister, but this is a case that's new. From an ethical standpoint, this is something that we've never seen. And so my question is, should the screens not be known by everyone, and are they enough?
Quick response. Unfortunately, Mr. Greene, go ahead.
I still think that Bill C5 could be considered a matter of general application. And I would not be convinced that there are potential conflicts of interest here.
Thank you, Mr. Greene.
Merci beaucoup. Croyez-vous qu'on...
Thank you. Do you believe we should expand the Conflict of Interest Act to include the appearance of conflict of interest? Is that something that we should look into in order to ensure that if there's the appearance of a conflict of interest that we could act and investigate, or should we wait for a real conflict of interest?
I think that the Ethics Commissioner should advise with regard to how elected MPs and cabinet ministers can avoid apparent conflict of interest as well as real conflict of interest. The public doesn't understand the difference between the two. It's pretty arcane for them. So if you're found to be in an apparent conflict of interest, in the public eye, it's almost as bad as being in a real conflict of interest, sometimes worse. So yes, I think the act should include both. The penalties for being in an apparent conflict of interest shouldn't be as severe as being in a real conflict of interest. But I think all politicians need to make sure that they need to avoid those as well. But as I mentioned earlier, it's something I think your committee should look into. If the act is going to be amended to include apparent conflict of interest, how can this be done in the most effective way?
I'm going to conclude today with Mr. Saini for 5 minutes. Go ahead, Mr. Saini.
Professor Greene, the whole afternoon thing has been only focused on one. That's the Prime Minister of Canada. I find it disturbing that we are looking for people who has never done any business to be the public holders of the most effective office in this country. And I find that disturbing. But beside that, my question to you is, if someone who is holding a public office has to divert their entire investment portfolio when entering public life versus the option of utilizing a blind trust, could you give your opinion?
I think it's counterproductive for the public office holders to divest everything. I once worked for a cabinet minister in Alberta, Peter Lougheed was the premier. At that time, in 1972, he required all his cabinet ministers to sell all their stocks and bonds, including my minister, who had to sell his penny stocks and bonds. I think that was overreach, but in those days we hadn't thought of better ways of preventing real conflicts of interest. we were in the early days. So I think the current regime is much better, and it makes it more attractive for good people to get involved in politics.
Thank you.